Next we have Tessa Getchis from the Yukon speaking about Connecticut Seafood public awareness, perceptions, preferences, and use patterns. This is 800 Allen right here.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everyone. It's been great to learn from you this week, so thanks for sharing your information. And I'm pretty excited to talk to you today about some of the work that we've been doing in Connecticut. And I wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, and we've had many partners on this project, so too many to name, but they've been from industry, the regulatory community, researchers, environmental groups, concerned citizens, so it's been pretty exciting. It works. Thanks, Alan. So this afternoon, this is a brief overview about the Connecticut seafood and aquaculture industry. I'm going to talk about some of our planning efforts in the state to grow the industry. And again, we've basically been facilitating this process through our Shellfish initiative. Can't hear me. And we've been working to better understand and increase public awareness. So seafood is a multi-million-dollar industry in Connecticut. Aquaculture is the primary source of the seafood supply, and aquaculture production in the state has been growing and expanding, while capture fisheries have been in decline. The seafood industry provides thousands of jobs, most of them for family-owned operations like this, and aquaculture jobs are expanding as growers get involved in more value-added processing and also in direct marketing. Most of our wild-caught seafood are harvested in Long Island Sound, with the exception of sea scallops, which are harvested offshore. What's interesting is that most of these species are not on the top 10 list of seafoods consumed by Americans. Commercial aquaculture in our state involves the farming of bivalve shellfish and seaweeds and freshwater fish. Our major species are the eastern oyster and the northern quahog, and they make up about 90% of the harvest. As with wild harvest, most of these aquaculture species are not part of the top 10 that are consumed. They're not part of the typical diet. They're specialty products that are consumed in restaurants. That being said, recreational harvest in our state is a big deal. It's part of the culture and tradition, and for those people who are engaged in activities, they're really excited, and they like to pass this on. Seafood has been harvested in our state for thousands of years, and aquaculture is a tradition that's 2 centuries old. Recreational harvest is more than $2 million to our local economy. We just recently conducted an economic assessment. And of course, angling is a big deal. We don't have an economic assessment on that right now, but that's in the tens of millions. This recreational harvest is a big deal to us because it presents us with a unique opportunity to engage the public. So we talk about aquaculture, we talk about seafood, and we talk about the practices that they do on land and how that impacts those aquaculture areas. So how it impacts the water quality and how that affects them being able to harvest seafood from these areas. And that brings us to our Shellfish initiative. So over the past several years, Sea Grant and our other partner organizations have been bringing people together to identify issues, provide some context, and develop recommendations to grow aquaculture and seafood. We started with a list of more than 100 recommendations, and we worked with stakeholders over the past few years to narrow that down and prioritize that list. And we've published recommendations, which can be found on our website, but basically we're about at 30 recommendations. And some of them are quite specific, and now we're working on an implementation plan. So one of the key issues and sort of a cross-cutting issue of importance is this public awareness. And our stakeholder groups told us that they really wanted us to work on increasing public awareness in our state, and specifically with Connecticut residents. So under the umbrella of the Shellfish initiative, we set out to document the economic, the environmental, and social importance of seafood and aquaculture in Connecticut, and then to identify ways to get that information out to residents. So we all know that increasing awareness is important, and you've heard a number of different talks over the past few days, but in addition to those issues, in Connecticut, aquaculture is changing, and this is part of the impetus for our public awareness campaign. So we see a lot of boats like this out in the water, but that's all you see, and I think that's kind of beautiful. We have an oyster and clamming industry, but they're mainly a dredging industry, and so it's a bottom harvest. It's all underwater, which is great, but it's changing. So aquaculture is becoming a lot more visible, and so you see things like this in people's backyards. This is new, so this is not everywhere, but this is starting to pop up, and we have probably 5 to 10 applications a month that are proposing something like this. So they're not all permitted. And it's happening closer to shore, and there are lots of competing uses in Long Island Sound. We also have a developing seaweed industry, and that's a lot of gear at the surface. And so that's becoming more visible, drawing attention to aquaculture, and it's not always positive attention. One other impetus for these efforts is that we have a lot of people saying that Connecticut residents are losing their connection to the sea. So we have dwindling numbers of youth that are involved in recreational activities. We can actually track that with permit sales. We have a decrease in the number of commercial fishermen. We have a lot of retirees from management agencies at the local, state, and federal level. And this picture on the left, this little girl is my daughter. She loves clams. She loves eating them because I taught her how to dig them, because my dad taught me and his dad taught him. This man at the bottom is the father of my daughter's, one of her best friends. So he's an aquaculturist, but not everybody has that experience. So if we're going to get the public to support aquaculture and seafood harvest, they need to know about it. So this brings us to our plan of work. So we're trying to increase awareness in our state. We want people to know the importance, all of the different points, not only the economics, but environmental and social aspects. We want to get them into the water to experience that. And what we want to do is hopefully affect behavior change, and that's difficult. We've taken a few first steps, and so what we wanted to do was gather essential information about aquaculture in Connecticut and seafood production and tell people about that. So I'm just going to go through a few things that we've done in a sort of haphazard manner at first. So we came up with these list of facts, but I have fact sheets out on the table, you can see those. But basically some basic information about shellfish, about seaweed, and about aquaculture. We also developed some tools so people can see where these farms are located and where you can harvest shellfish from. So we have an online database that people can search to see where the farms are, and we have a recreational app in progress so people can find out what towns they can go recreational fishing and harvesting in. And this is a great tool for us to be able to visualize aquaculture in the context of all the other activities in the Sound, and it's a great planning tool for managers. We've developed a number of pubs and websites. We're just getting into video, so I'm going to be calling Dave a lot for instruction. We had a reception to launch our initiative, and I think the most important part of this is that we had local officials and elected and appointed officials at the state level, and to have them come to our building with industry members and hear about the importance of aquaculture and to sort of celebrate the history rather than talking about the threat of Vibrio constantly was a big deal, and the industry was getting pats on the back for doing the good things that they were doing. We also had an art contest, and I've heard of a few of these happening around the country, but this was another medium for us to basically demonstrate, visualize aquaculture and its importance. We had a youth contest, we had an adult contest. It was a lot of fun, and this is our Sea Grant director with one of our winners. We recently held an event for chefs. Anushka organized this. This is really interesting. We have a state chefs association, over 500 chefs, many of them interested in aquaculture but didn't know much about it. This is a group we really need to tap into. And Sea Grant also funded an aquaculture bus tour, so we were able to bring 70 people across the state to expose them to aquaculture farms and have farmers talk about their practices, about their products. We served their products. It was awesome. Most of these people lived inland, and inland in Connecticut isn't that far. So, but they had no idea that what aquaculture was and that they could get local seafood and that it was safe. We had the opportunity to go to scores of local community events, and this is pretty exciting. we use this as a tool to collect information. And so we wanted to basically canvass the public at first and find out what they knew, what they were interested in with respect to seafood and aquaculture. And we just asked them, it was an anonymous survey, 4 questions to identify aquaculture species, if they could identify the benefits of aquaculture, if they knew the value of commercial harvest, and if they knew that they were able to go out and dig a bucket of clams in their backyard. And we sorted their responses by zip code. So we got a good number of responses. This is over a 2-year period at these different events. And the basic gist of the story here is that there was limited awareness. So most people failed the quiz. The only thing that stood out is that people who lived in areas where there was commercial activity, so towns where there was aquaculture, tended to know more. So a little bit of information. But the anecdotes you can see up here, most people didn't know that we had an industry. Even if they lived in a town where there was recreational harvest and the town was promoting that, most of them had no idea. Most of the people that we encountered at those events, we were teaching them how to grow shellfish, or excuse me, harvest shellfish, and they were throwing them back because they didn't understand that it was okay to eat them. They didn't think they were safe. They thought it was just a demo. So that was surprising to us. And they were concerned, of course, about mercury warnings, their local harvest warnings, and so most people tended to say that they were staying away from seafood, whether it was local or not. So this brings us to the project that was recently funded by Sea Grant. It was a follow-up, and we're just working on this now. We're about to engage in this survey to not just canvass the public, but really to get a good representative sample of our residents on what they know about, what they care about, and the choices they make when they purchase seafood or harvest seafood. And if that translates into a willingness to pay, because we know people say they care about local, they care about sustainability. That doesn't necessarily translate into a decision, or they're willing to pay more for farmed versus wild salmon. It really all comes down to their wallet. And we want to use this information to inform future outreach efforts. And so it won't just be Sea Grant. Again, we have a lot of partner organizations, and a lot of them, like Mystic Aquarium, is much more suited to talk to youth than we are. But if we all have the same message rather than working in silos, we can have a broader reach. So we have 4 focus areas. They're awareness, again, of Connecticut seafood products and of aquaculture practices, of aquaculture farms in our state. Perceptions of these terms like sustainable and food safety and security, and how that relates to their choices, the preferences and willingness to pay. And then we're following up on 2 studies that have been conducted over the past few decades that have looked at use patterns in our state. So we know that typical American consumers, they eat, 16.5 pounds or around 16 pounds a year of seafood. So in Connecticut, we typically consume more of that, probably because we're coastal and we have some access. And we have data for the past 2 decades, so we're going to follow up on that as well and see if it's changed. So our next steps are basically to look at the survey data and say, do we do more of the same, these sort of haphazard events where we meet and greet people and make them feel good about seafood and aquaculture? Do we borrow other messages that are working from our colleagues around the room that have already tried this? Or do we create new messages and find some specific audiences where these messages really resonate? So it's probably going to be a mix of that, but we're looking forward to working with those of you who are already working in that area and really hope that that translates into some decision making that helps support aquaculture development and support people eating more local seafood. Do I have time for questions?
One quick one.
Okay.
Question for Tess? I know I had this
Terry.
effect. I know I had this effect on you.
So, I mean, in Washington State, we had the first plan, and so we don't have the high, we were able to look at other plans.
Get out of this or stay.
When I've been
See
reviewing
what the
the
next one
plan,
looks like.
it's hard for me to identify who's gonna do what.
That's what we're working on.
So as a steering committee, you're gonna assign people to do things, or how does it, and how often do you check in with your steering committee? And also with greater stakeholders?
Okay, that's a really good question. So we officially launched the implementation phase in the fall, and what that means is that we're deciding the who, what, when. Do you want me to repeat it here? we're working on implementation now, so that's the who, the why, the what, the when, the how much this will all cost, and the timeline for that. So we're starting to prioritize different issues and be very specific about who will take on the responsibility and, you know, and when. So all that is being laid out in a plan that'll be much longer than that brief summary that we launched. And then we work with our stakeholders on a regular basis, but our steering committee is twice a year in person and then quarterly where we're checking in and basically touching base with them and making sure that we're on the right track.
So can I follow up? So you mentioned that you're looking at money. In the Washington plan, we do not identify funds and do not identify the cost of anything because we anticipate that people will do the work because it's such a high essential item and that we ask people to reassign their work schedules in order to do that. Are you looking at a bidding kind of thing and that if they can't get the money, you don't do the work, or?
No, you know, people are already doing work, so they're already using those recommendations as justification for their grant proposals, and some have been funded. So we funded Vibrio work through our Connecticut Sea Grant program based on one agency coming forward and saying, it's in your plan, and it aligns with your strategic plan, so, yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Dale Levitt from Roger Williams University, which is in Rhode Island, for you, those of you that are not familiar with Rhode Island. Speaking about NARFnet. We're going to find out what that is.
Yes, you will.
Using demonstration farms to showcase new aquaculture technology. Go ahead, Dale.
Thank you, sir. So how many people know who this guy is? Fred, do you know who he is? Because I think you worked with him, didn't you?
Looks like Fred.
Seaman Knapp is usually referred to as the father of cooperative extension, and probably his most famous quote is that what a man hears he may doubt, what he sees he may also doubt, but what he does he cannot doubt. And so he believed that farmers would not adopt new farming practices unless, if they just saw them on some kind of a public demonstration, and that they in fact needed to actually test that technology out on their farms before they'd be willing to implement it into their normal production schedule. And so he had this idea of using cooperative farm demonstrations with farmers on their own farms to showcase technology and to try to induce implementation in the neighborhood. There are some that argue that that doesn't happen today. I'm not sure I agree with this, but oftentimes the modern technology is transitioned too quickly from the research stage to the commercial stage without proper vetting on commercial farms, which is sort of what Knapp was advocating for. So keep that in mind as I talk a little bit about aquaculture in the Northeast. And as John Ewart said on the other day, that we're seeing a really rapid expansion of aquaculture in the Northeast, and is primarily in the shellfish sector. And so, although, as Tessa's just alluded to, we have a very long history of growing shellfish in the Northeast, it's really since the 1990s that we're really seeing the industry take off. And just as a quick example, this is the development of the industry in Rhode Island since the mid-1990s, and we're growing at a rate of about 10.5 acres per year, which in Rhode Island is about 10% of our land mass. And it represents about 3 new farms, and just in the last 3 years, we're actually seeing an even greater increase, as you can see by the blip increase in both acreage and farms. However, the technology that people are using in the Northeast is basically the technology that they started with in the 1990s. And so even though aquaculture's been advancing very quickly, and we've been seeing development of all kinds of new technologies outside of our region, it's been slow, if non-existent, to see the adoption of these new practices. And I'll just give you one quick example. Someone has already mentioned the triploid oyster. You all know the adage not to eat oysters in months that don't have R in them. That's primarily because the condition is of poor quality because of spawning events. However, the introduction of the concept of this triploid oyster, which was first advocated in 1984, sort of allows oysters to hold their condition through the summer because they are infertile, at least a large percentage of them are. And so that technology was introduced in '84. By 1994, when Stan Allen went out to Washington State, and by 1994, half of the industry was using triploid oysters. And just an example, coast oysters, 22 billion seed that they were putting out, half of them were triploids in 1994. However, in 2006, in the Northeast, there was not a single triploid oyster being utilized on farms. And the only reason that it has started now is because a small group on Cape Cod, led by Bill Walton, Diane Murphy, and Josh Reitzma, put on a small local on-farm commercial demonstration of triploid use. And the local farmers rapidly realized, after seeing somebody else selling high-quality oysters in the middle of the summer, that this was probably a really good advantageous aspect of improving their culture. So it really took over 20 years for this idea of triploid oysters to be implemented, and it was because of an on-farm commercial demonstration that it actually happened. So taking that initial research effort that was initiated by Bill and Diane and Josh on the Cape, a group of us put together a proposal to establish a Northeast Research Farm Network, which is where NARFNet comes from. And so what we proposed was that we would take the 6 northeastern coastal states, identify up to 5 commercial operating farms in the state, and then try out some new technologies on those farms. And so we applied to the National Sea Grant Aquaculture Extension RFP, and we got funded through that. And so we picked out a couple of technologies, and our friend from Alaska showed some pictures of flip bags. I don't think he spoke of them specifically, but this concept has been used in the Northwest for a number of years now. It was first suggested by a grower down in Australia, but it was adopted by a West Coast grower and has rapidly expanded. And basically what it does is it allows the bag to flip with the tide, which in turn chips off a lot of the new shell growth, which induces a deeper cup, which makes it a much more attractive raw bar product. And so it had been used very successfully with the Pacific oyster, but to my knowledge hadn't been tried, at least not in our area, on our eastern oyster. And so basically the idea is to hang either ADPI bags, these conventional oyster bags, or we started playing around with some of the oyster, the Australian technology, SEPA and BST bags. And you put them on an apparatus where one side's attached to a pivot on a long line and the other side has a float on it. And so as the tide comes and goes, it causes the bag to rotate 180 degrees. And so you basically are tumbling your oysters twice a day. And in theory, that gives us a much better cup shape and a much more attractive oyster for the raw bar market. So that was technology number one. And that was an idea that I stole from the West Coast. Another idea I stole from the West Coast was using some kind of artificial media to grow what would normally be an infaunal clam, a clam that exists buried in the sediment. And so I've been proposed to use this product called Hydrotone, which is an expanded clay pellet, which